Hi guys, my name is Oscar and this is how I built a Windows PC using spare parts.
The first thing we're going to do is select our components.
We have a selection of spare components to use. As our motherboard, we're going to use the ASRock Vitality H97 killer. For the CPU, we are using the Intel Core i7-4770. For the CPU fan, we will use the stock Intel Core. For our RAM, we're going to be using 32GB of Corsair Vengeance 1600MHz DDR3. For our GPU, we're going to be using an Asus Strix GTX 970. For our network connection, we will be using a PCIe Wi-Fi card. For our power supply unit, we'll be using a Deepcool 450 watt power supply. For our enclosure, we are using a Sigotip ATX side window chassis. This is going to be large enough to fit all of our components. Here we have our motherboard. First we are going to remove the protective cover of the CPU socket. We're going to carefully lift the holder as so. We're going to make sure that the CPU is correctly orientated. There are some notches that will line up with the socket. Very carefully placing the CPU into the socket. We now re-secure the CPU. If it's been done properly, the top plate will lock in place. My first step is to remove the side panel. This is to prepare for installing the power supply. I place the chassis on its side and place the power supply in, ensuring the cables are clear. There are 4 screws to secure the power supply in the chassis. I then move on to motherboard installation. The first step is to install the standoffs. This creates separation between the chassis and the motherboard. I need to make sure the standoffs are all in the correct place. I then fit in the I/O shield. This fits in the space at the rear of the chassis. I simply line it up and pop it in place. I then place the chassis over the standoffs, being careful with the motherboard as I place it in. I line up the standoff with the holes in the motherboard and fit the motherboard with the I/O shield. I then screw the motherboard down, being careful to not over tighten the screws. I continue this until all the screws are down snug. Once I've completed this step, It will look something like this. I'll then move on to cable management, bringing the wires from the power supply to the motherboard. I'll start connecting the main power to the motherboard, as well as the CPU power to the motherboard. The next step is to install the CPU fan. I'll start applying the thermal paste to the CPU. I'll spread the paste evenly. It should be a thin layer and cover the top of the processor. Next, I'll orientate the cooler and place it straight down. Once the cooler has been fit, it will press through the motherboard to fasten. I then connect the USB 3 from the chassis to the motherboard. I then insert the GPU, being careful to align it. I fit the GPU into the slot. This is the top PCIe slot. I connect the PCIe power to the GPU. I then prepare to install the RAM. I carefully place in the DIMMs, clicking one side in and then the other. I repeat until all 4 DIMMs are in place. Once complete, it will look something like this. I double check that everything is done properly. Lastly, I unbox the monitor and go through setup. That's it, I hope you enjoyed.